Hey everyone, welcome back. So as my first entry to the Indian Scale Modelers Cold War Warsaw Pact group build, here is the complete time-lapse build of the Zil-131 fuel truck. This was a first in many aspects. It was my first ever ICM kit, the first ever vehicle kit, and the first ever truck model that I had endeavored to build. So let's see what we have in store. The box art shows a very nice artwork of the Zil-131 fuel truck from ICM, the technical name for it being the ATZ-4-131. It's a 72nd scale model. Jumping inside the box, we are greeted with a set of sprues on which the tires are mounted. Further in, there is a single plastic bag with all the sprues and parts, which are the driver's cabin, the front hull of the truck, followed by a sprue with the fuel tank assembly parts, a second sprue with the suspension systems and fenders, and a last sprue with the oil and gas tank assemblies. This is followed by the single-page instruction sheet, which is just 5 assembly steps, deceiving, as you will find out shortly. A clear sprue and the decals, which I wouldn't use. The first problem I encountered was that the actual sprues weren't named A, B, C, D, and E as in the instruction sheet. So I stuck up some masking tape on the sprues and wrote their identification letters on the tape. The build began with the cutting off and the cleaning up of the lower chassis. I then began working on the tires, as this would be a quick assembly to go with and also set the momentum for the build. The two separate parts of the tires were glued together, followed by the hub assembly. Next, I began working on the rear wheel suspension systems. The left and right suspension cantilevers connect to each other with two differential bridge assemblies, followed by the power transmission shaft on top of the bridge. I then moved on to the assembly of the fuel tank. This was rather straightforward, and the left and right halves were joined up using super glue. At this point, I felt that the feel of the model would be very flimsy, so I wanted a heavy feel, and so I stuffed in some clay into the tank to give it the heavy feel. The left and right tank handlebars were then attached to the front of the tank. Finally, the footrest was added and I began working on the crew ladder. While gluing, I found that the crew ladder was longer by about 3 millimeters, so I cut out the extra length from the lower side of the ladder halves and then joined the halves together and attached them to the footrest on top of the tank. I observed some seam lines all along the length of the tank, and these had to be filled and sanded. I used ComFill automotive filler to fill the seam lines. And then used progressive wet sanding with 100, 220 and 400 grit sandpaper, followed by a 600 grit for smoothing and 1200 grit for polishing. I then painted the fire extinguisher with Camlin's Scarlet Lake and the suspension system with Fevicryl Copper. Next, I began working on the front chassis assembly and began by attaching the mud flaps to the front chassis. This was followed by the assembly of the side view mirrors, and as you can see, these were extremely small and fiddly parts and wouldn't fit in one go. So a lot of patience was needed to make these fit together to the sides of the doors. Next, I assembled the gas tanks for the truck, pretty straightforward assemblies, and then moved on to paint and detail the driver's cabin. The steering wheel, the gear and the 6-wheel drive levers were painted black. The dashboard was detailed with a bit of blue and red, simply for some visual pleasure. And although the cabin details wouldn't be visible once the truck is assembled, nonetheless, I painted it for the sheer fun, pleasure and relaxation that painting gives me before or after a hard day's work. I then began painting the tires with Fevicryl Grey. All the tires were mounted on toothpicks and in turn mounted on some Play-Doh attached to an old credit card as a flat surface to give me the access and 360-degree maneuverability to paint all the tires at once. I then began spraying the fuel tank with Fevicryl Olive Drab, which was prepared with a mix of sap green, a bit of dark brown, and black. I then assembled the engine driveshaft in the mount, followed by the assembly of the engine and transmission system construction. The 3 air tanks, and other small bits and bobs into the lower chassis, followed by some detail painting of these parts. Fevicryl Olive Drab was then sprayed in thin layers on the front chassis. Finally, I began assembling the suspension systems and wheels into the lower chassis. As I was gluing the front wheels to the suspension with super glue, a spur of the moment thought to give the truck a visual appearance of standing in a turning stance came to my mind, and I glued the front tires accordingly in a left turning stance. Finally, the lower chassis was assembled on top of the rear suspension system, and then the gas tanks were glued on. This was followed by the assembly of the front fender. It was then time to assemble the front and rear windshields, left and right side windows, and the headlamp glass covers in the front chassis. I used Humbrol polycement that I had from a previous kit to glue the clear parts together, as the super glue is known to clog and fog up the clear parts. This was then followed by the final bit of lower chassis detailing. And the painting of the headlights and indicator lamps. The headlamp protector grills, which were previously painted silver, were then added. And finally, with the addition of the fire extinguisher, the assembly of the front chassis was complete. Finally, it was time for the decals, for which I used the Bright Spark decal sheets. I used the Indian Air Force and Bharatiya Vayu Sena decals, and one roundel from the two spare sheets, and this was all that was needed, as the fuel trucks are pretty stencilless. The standard procedure of applying decals was used. I applied watered down PVA glue to the place where the decals would go, and then dipped the decal in warm water for 30 to 45 seconds, and then gently with a soft brush slid the decals onto the position, and then cleaned off the excess water with a cotton Q-tip. Finally, it was time to weather the truck, and I scraped off a dark earthy brown from the Camlin Soft Pastels color box into a small container and added water to the mix, and then added a few drops of dishwashing liquid to create a dark wash. This wash was then liberally applied all over the truck and then left to dry for about 15 to 20 minutes. Post that, I cleaned up with a paper towel and further refined the weathering using a cotton Q-tip. I was told by an expert that these trucks were pretty well maintained and clean while in use, so I had to remove most of the wash and leave just a subtle bit of it in a few places that would be realistically dirty or grimy. Finally, with all the modules glued up, here is the completed model of the Zil-131 fuel truck of the Indian Air Force as used during the 1990s on various Indian air bases. These trucks were known to be bought by India as Russian surplus when India purchased MiGs from Russia during the Cold War years. My idea ahead is to place this truck in an airbase diorama that I'm building on and would have a video of it out shortly. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed building the model. If you liked my video, click the thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.